On November 19th, 1928, lighthouse keeper Thomas Marshall was polishing the lens of Waugoshance Light when he saw the first body floating past his window. By the time the sun set, 3 days later, he'd counted 47. All of them wore the same uniform from a ship that supposedly hadn't even left port yet. And so Thomas Marshall, a man who'd kept silent watch over Lake Michigan for 23 years, did something that would cost him everything. He broke protocol and sent out a radio message. Thomas Marshall was 52 years old, with hands permanently stained by lamp oil and a gray beard, his wife Eleanor trimmed every Sunday when she visited from Mackinaw City. He'd been the keeper at Waugoshance Light since 1905, and in all those years he'd never missed a single night of lighting the beacon. The lighthouse sat on a shoal 2 miles from Michigan's northern shore, rising from the water like a castle tower painted in black and white stripes. Most keepers considered Waugoshance a punishment, posting isolated, storm-battered, and according to local legend, haunted by the ghost of a keeper who died there in the 1890s. But Thomas loved it. He kept a journal in neat script, documenting everything from wind speeds to the migration patterns of the herring gulls that nested on the gallery. On quiet mornings, he'd sit at his desk by the watchroom window, writing letters to his daughter Margaret in Chicago. She was 24 now, married to an accountant, expecting her first child in the spring. Thomas had already started whittling a wooden rattle from driftwood. He kept it in the drawer beside his pipe tobacco. The morning of November 19th started like any other. Thomas woke at 4:30, checked the light mechanism, recorded the temperature 28 degrees, and made his coffee. The lake was calm, unusual for late November when the notorious Straits of Mackinac typically churned with pre-winter storms. He was polishing the third order Fresnel lens, a ritual he performed every Tuesday when movement in the water caught his eye. At first, he thought it was debris. The shipping lanes between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron saw heavy traffic, and flotsam wasn't uncommon. But as it drifted closer, pushed by the gentle northern current, Thomas set down his polishing cloth. It was a body, a man, face down, wearing what looked like a naval uniform. Thomas had seen bodies before. 23 years on the lakes, you saw everything eventually. Ships went down. Sailors drowned, especially during the vicious November gales. Protocol was clear. Note the sighting in the log. Signal any passing vessels to attempt recovery. Report it during the evening radio check. The Coast Guard would handle it. But something made Thomas reach for his binoculars. Maybe it was the uniform too clean, too new. Or maybe it was the strange calm of the water, the way the body moved with purpose rather than randomly tumbling in the waves. Through the magnified lenses he could see details, brass buttons, a peaked cap still somehow attached, epaulets on the shoulders. And then he saw the ship's name embroidered on the sleeve, SS Templeton. The Templeton. Thomas knew that name. Every keeper on the lakes knew the major freighters. She was a 450-foot ore carrier, less than 2 years old, state-of-the-art with radio equipment and safety features. Based out of Detroit, crew of 38 men. But the Templeton was supposed to be in port for winter maintenance. Thomas had heard it himself on the shipping news just 3 days ago, and so naturally, this changed everything. One body in a Templeton uniform could be explained. Maybe a crew member who'd fallen overboard on their last run, finally washing up. But as Thomas watched, a second body appeared in his field of vision. Same uniform, then a third. By noon, he'd counted 11 bodies, all drifting past in the same northern current, all wearing Templeton uniforms. His log entry for 12:15 p.m., later recovered by investigators, captures his growing unease. Multiple casualties observed. All appear to be recent. Uniforms match SS Templeton crew. Ship reported in Detroit dock as of November 16. Something is very wrong. Protocol demanded he wait until the 8 p.m. radio check to report non-emergency observations. But Thomas had been on the lakes long enough to know when protocol needed to be broken. At 12:47 p.m., he fired up the lighthouse's powerful radio transmitter and sent out a general call. Waugoshance Light to all stations. Multiple bodies observed in shipping channel. Appear to be crew of SS Templeton. Repeat, Multiple Templeton crew in the water. Immediate assistance required. The response was immediate and troubling. The Coast Guard station at Mackinac City acknowledged his message, but seemed confused. The harbor master in Detroit came on the frequency, Waugoshance Light. This is Detroit Harbor. Templeton is moored at Dock 7. Has been here since November 15th. Please confirm your observation. But Thomas had no doubt about what he was seeing. By 2 p.m., the count had risen to 19 bodies. They came in waves, sometimes 3 or 4 visible at once through his window, all moving in the same deliberate current, all wearing those distinctive Templeton uniforms with the brass buttons and ship name clearly visible. And so Thomas did something he'd never done in 23 years. He abandoned his post during daylight hours. The lighthouse had a small motor launch for emergencies, and Thomas fired it up, fighting through the freezing spray to reach the nearest body. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The dead man was young, maybe 25, with the kind of rope-hardened hands that marked him as deck crew. His uniform was pristine except for being waterlogged. No signs of decomposition. He couldn't have been in the water more than a day or two. In his pocket, Thomas found a waterlogged wallet with identification, Marcus Webb, able seaman, SS Templeton, home address in Milwaukee. But that wasn't even the worst part. As Thomas examined the body, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The man's watch had stopped at 11:43. Not AM-to-date windows showed November 18th, yesterday. If the Templeton had been safely docked in Detroit since the 15th, how had one of her crew ended up dead in Lake Michigan on the 18th? What happened next would haunt investigators for decades. Thomas returned to the lighthouse and immediately sent another transmission, this time on the emergency frequency. Bodies show time of death as November 18th. Templeton crew confirmed by identification. How can ship be in Detroit if crew is here? The response this time was different. Sharp. Official. Waugoshance Light. Cease transmission immediately. Federal Shipping Authority will investigate. Maintain radio silence until further notice. But the bodies kept coming. By sunset on November 19th, Thomas had counted 29. He photographed what he could with the lighthouse's camera, documenting the horrific parade passing his window. His journal from that night, recovered from his quarters, reveals a man struggling to understand what he was witnessing. They drift past, like a funeral procession. Same uniforms, same direction, same terrible purpose. Someone knows what happened. Someone is lying. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Therefore, November 20th brought fog so thick Thomas could barely see the water. But he could hear things, splashing, the bump of objects against the lighthouse's base. When the fog lifted in the afternoon, 8 more bodies were visible. Total count, 37. Therefore, Thomas made a decision that would seal his fate. Despite the federal order for radio silence, he contacted his friend at the Mackinac City newspaper, Harold Brennan. Using the lighthouse's telephone line, a recent addition for emergencies, Thomas told Harold everything: the bodies, the uniforms, the federal order to stop transmitting. Harold, sensing the story of a lifetime, promised to investigate the Templeton's true whereabouts. But Harold never got the chance. His editor later testified that Harold received a visit from 2 federal agents that evening. They confiscated his notes and warned him that publishing anything about the Templeton would be considered an act of treason under the Maritime Security Act. Harold, with a family to feed, stayed silent. Meanwhile, at the Waugoshance Light, Thomas continued his grim count. And so November 21st brought 6 more bodies. Total 43. His final log entry, dated November 21st, 10:47 p.m., is chilling in its simplicity. 47 souls now. I know what happened. They're coming for me. Tell Eleanor I love her. Tell Margaret to name the baby Thomas if it's a boy. At 11:15 p.m. on November 21st, 1928, the light at Waugoshance went dark for the first time in Thomas Marshall's 23-year tenure. The sudden silence was deafening. No mechanical clicking of the rotating lens. No hum of the clockwork mechanism that had filled the tower for decades. Ships passing through the straits reported an unnatural darkness, where the beacon should have blazed, the lighthouse tower, a black tooth against the star-filled sky. For Captain William Morse of the freighter Huron Queen, those 3 hours waiting for dawn felt like days, each minute stretching as he navigated the treacherous straits without the Lighthouse's guidance. The Coast Guard cutter Manitou was dispatched at dawn. What they found defied explanation. Thomas Marshall was gone. His quarters were neat, bed made, dishes washed, but the air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt paper, as if documents had been hastily destroyed. The light mechanism was in perfect working order. It had been deliberately shut off. The brass clockwork weights hung motionless, their usual ticking silenced forever. On his desk, investigators found his journal, his camera with exposed film, and 47 brass buttons laid out in neat rows. Templeton uniform buttons, each one carefully removed from a waterlogged uniform. The metal was still cold to the touch, as if they'd just been pulled from icy water. Beside them lay Thomas's pocket watch, stopped at exactly 11:15 p.m. But Thomas himself had vanished. No body, no note beyond his final log entry, no sign of struggle. The motor launch was still tied at the dock. The lighthouse's doors were all locked from the inside. In his final moments, Thomas Marshall's only thought found scrawled on a piece of paper crumpled in the wastebasket was a single word. Why? The official report, filed on November 30th, 1928, concluded that Thomas had suffered a mental breakdown due to isolation, imagined the bodies, and thrown himself into the lake. The 47 buttons were dismissed as artifacts he'd collected over the years. The photographs he'd taken were reportedly destroyed in a darkroom accident before they could be developed. But then, on December 3rd, a fisherman near Beaver Island pulled up his nets to find them tangled with a life preserver. On it, clearly stenciled, S.S. Templeton. More debris followed: cargo hatches, personal effects, pieces of uniform, all from a ship supposedly safe in Detroit. The truth emerged in pieces over the following months, whispered in dockside taverns and Coast Guard stations. The Templeton had never made it to Detroit. She'd gone down in a sudden squall on November 18th exactly, when the watches on those bodies had stopped. The shipping company, facing bankruptcy and unable to afford another disaster after losing 2 ships that year, had conspired with corrupt officials to cover it up. They'd reported the ship safely docked while frantically trying to locate and hide evidence of her sinking. Thomas Marshall had stumbled onto their secret floating past his window. 47 men the Templeton carried a crew of 48, with one survivor who was paid to disappear, had died while their employer pretended they were alive. And Thomas had paid the price for trying to expose it. Naturally, his body was never found. Eleanor waited at the Mackinaw City docks every morning for 6 months, hoping he'd somehow return. Margaret named her son Thomas, as her father had wished. The boy grew up to become a maritime historian, dedicated to uncovering the truth about Great Lake shipping disasters. Waugoshance Light was automated in 1929, just months after Thomas disappeared. No keeper ever lived there again. But sailors passing through the straits still report something strange on foggy November nights. They see a light in the abandoned tower's window, not the automated beacon, but the warm glow of a kerosene lamp. And sometimes, they say, you can see a silhouette in that window watching, still counting, still bearing witness to the 47 souls who floated past, seeking justice that never came.